It began with a silence so deep, even the footmen in the halls of Buckingham Palace paused mid-step, unsure whether to speak, breathe, or simply listen. Behind closed doors, King Charles III stood motionless, a letter in his hand and a storm brewing in his eyes. A single sheet of paper, no grand announcement, no golden seal, just black ink and a truth that threatened to unravel the legacy of Britain's most storied monarchy. The truth was unthinkable. The truth, if proven, would change the monarchy forever. At the heart of this royal upheaval was not a scandal of wealth or power. It wasn't political. It wasn't even about betrayal in the traditional sense. It was about a child, a boy, a name known the world over, Archie Harrison, Mountbatten Windsor. And it was about whether he belonged to the royal family at all. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The questions had been whispered for years, dismissed as tabloid gossip or wild conspiracy theories born of envy and resentment. Was Archie truly a royal? Why had so much of his early life been shrouded in secrecy? Why were traditions broken, names omitted, photographs blurred? But the royal family had a long tradition of ignoring the noise, brushing off headlines, and keeping family matters private. Until now, the truth had clawed its way to the surface, and the man now wearing the crown had no choice but to confront it. But before this moment of reckoning, before the title stripping and the private weeping and the thunderstorm of royal fallout, there was a story, a carefully constructed illusion, a stage set by two of the most watched people on the planet, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. It began with love. It spiraled into rebellion. And now, it has come crashing down into something far darker, something unspeakable. The beginning of that story is key to understanding why what just happened has shaken the monarchy at its core. When Prince Harry introduced Meghan Markle to the world, the fairy tale seemed ready to write itself. The rebellious prince, long haunted by his mother's tragic death, had found joy again. Meghan was charismatic, beautiful, and seemingly ready to embrace a life of duty and honor. The world fell in love with them, or at least it wanted to. But that love turned to suspicion when the couple began to distance themselves, first emotionally, then geographically, from the institution they were meant to serve. Royal observers noticed it early on. Meghan's unwillingness to conform, Harry's defensive posturing during interviews, their friction with staff, and the waves of headlines questioning motives, sincerity, and strategy. Still, when Archie was born on May 6, 2019, much of that tension momentarily vanished. A royal baby had arrived, and for a short time, smiles replaced headlines. But there were things that didn't fit. Archie's birth wasn't announced in the usual way. No traditional photo op on the steps of the hospital. No press standing outside with cameras waiting for a glimpse of the swaddled royal heir. Instead, an oddly formal statement was released, and later, a strangely distant photo was issued. Harry, Meghan, and the Queen clustered together, but the newborn barely visible. The public had questions, but the palace remained tight-lipped. And then came the decision that raised even more eyebrows. Archie would not receive a royal title. The justification offered was about privacy, about letting the child grow up without the pressure of royal duties. But many found this confusing. Why give up protection, status, and history, unless there was something else at stake? Within months, Harry and Meghan had left the UK entirely. They renounced their royal roles and relocated to North America, declaring they would live a life of independence. They launched Archewell, signed deals with Netflix and Spotify, and positioned themselves as advocates, visionaries, and victims. And through all of it, Archie remained in the background, spoken of, but rarely seen, referenced, but not revealed. Behind the scenes, however, not everyone had moved on. Inside royal circles, concerns persisted. There were inconsistencies, dates that didn't align, documents that seemed vague, details that felt out of sync with protocol. And while King Charles had always sought to keep family matters private, there came a point when even he could no longer ignore what had reached his desk. A confidential report, compiled quietly, commissioned discreetly, prepared without Harry or Meghan's knowledge. It detailed communications, travel records, health data, and testimony from medical professionals. It hinted at the unthinkable, that Archie Harrison might not be biologically related to Prince Harry. And if true, it would mean more than just a breach of trust. It would call into question the legitimacy of a child born into the line of succession. No one wanted to believe it, least of all the king. The thought of denying a child his heritage, of stripping him of honor and protection, of publicly declaring him illegitimate, was agonizing. But tradition demanded verification, and the crown, above all, required truth. Sources close to the investigation claim that King Charles ordered a DNA analysis not once, but twice. The first test returned what was diplomatically termed inconclusive results. The second came with more certainty and devastating implications. The Y chromosome marker used to trace paternal lineage failed to match what had been expected from Prince Harry. The evidence, though delicately worded, was clear. Archie Harrison could not be the biological son of Prince Harry. This revelation wasn't met with anger, not at first. It was met with disbelief. The king reportedly summoned senior advisors, including the Lord Chamberlain and the royal private secretary, to ensure no procedural error had been made. For days, the palace operated in near silence, with even mid-level staffers unaware that something world-shattering had just landed behind the palace gates. And then came the confrontation. Prince Harry, upon being notified of the findings, was said to have collapsed into silence, according to one palace aide. His first response was confusion. His second, heartbreak. He demanded to see the full report. Meghan, when informed, was reportedly in Los Angeles attending a private branding meeting. She returned the moment she heard. Sources say she denied everything, vehemently. She insisted the tests were flawed, that the accusations were politically motivated, and that the entire inquiry was an attack on her motherhood. But it was too late. King Charles, long criticized for indecision in emotional matters, moved swiftly. A private letter was drafted. It stated in no uncertain terms that Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor would no longer be afforded the title of prince, nor would he retain any associated royal privileges. While not yet a public decree, it was now official within the confines of royal law. And just like that, a child who had once been the hopeful future of a modernized monarchy was cut loose from the crown. What happened next will be discussed for generations. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the coldness of legal documents and the harshness of DNA results, lay something deeper, the complete emotional shattering of a family. Harry reportedly wept in private, locking himself in his Montecito study for hours. Meghan was described by one aide as sobbing like she had been betrayed by the world. The pair had been the architects of their own royal departure, but now they were being ejected in the most personal way possible, and the world knew nothing. Not yet. What King Charles knew, and what the public is just beginning to learn, threatens to cast a long and merciless shadow over the Sussex legacy. Was this truly an act of deception? A mistake? A tragic misunderstanding? Or was it something more calculated? More deliberate? As the palace prepares for what may become the most scandalous public revelation in modern royal history, the question echoing from Windsor to Westminster, from Montecito to the Mall, is chilling. If Archie isn't Harry's, then whose is he? That's the question this story will uncover. In the chapters ahead, we'll pull back the curtain on everything, from the strange secrecy surrounding Archie's birth, to the explosive confrontation between father and son, to the irreversible decision that ripped a title from a boy and cast doubt on the entire Sussex legacy. So stay with us, because what you're about to hear next changes everything. The British monarchy has always been built on a delicate thread of tradition, duty, and lineage. From the moment a royal child is born, they are not merely a baby. They are an institution, a living symbol of history and continuity. For centuries, the House of Windsor has guarded its bloodline with a vigilance that borders on obsession. Every name, every title, every photograph of a newborn heir is catalogued and celebrated as part of a larger narrative, the unbroken chain that connects the past to the future. And yet, for Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor, that chain has always felt frayed, almost as though someone had tried to sever it before it could take root. Archie's arrival was meant to be a unifying moment for the royal family, a fresh chapter that bridged old traditions with modern values. When Meghan Markle married Prince Harry, there was a widespread belief that their union represented progress, diversity, and a new era for the monarchy. The couple was celebrated as the face of a royal family willing to embrace change. The world anticipated the birth of their first child as a defining moment, not just for the couple, but for the institution itself. But almost from the start, things did not unfold as expected. Unlike the births of Prince William's children, where the public saw the glowing parents emerge from the hospital doors with a newborn swaddled in royal blankets, Meghan and Harry's approach was markedly different. There were no public steps outside the Lindo wing, no cameras capturing the iconic first glance of the royal baby. Instead, announcements came in the form of carefully worded statements, and photographs, when they did arrive, felt carefully staged, almost too controlled. It was a departure from the transparency that the British public had grown to expect from their royals. This secrecy, while understandable from a parental perspective, ignited curiosity and suspicion among the public and the media. What were they trying to hide? Why the sudden break from tradition? The press, always hungry for royal drama, began spinning theories that ranged from invasive to outright bizarre. While much of it was dismissed as tabloid nonsense, whispers persisted, both within and beyond palace walls, that something about Archie's birth didn't quite add up. The significance of a royal birth goes far beyond mere ceremony. A child born into the line of succession represents the continuity of a monarchy that has survived wars, revolutions, and scandals. For King Charles, ensuring that the lineage remains untarnished has been a lifelong concern. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, famously embodied the idea that duty must always come before personal matters. Now, as Charles sits on the throne, he is tasked with upholding those same values, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Archie's position in the royal family was already unconventional. As the son of a prince who had stepped away from his senior royal duties, Archie's place in the hierarchy was different from that of his cousins. Harry and Meghan repeatedly expressed their desire to shield their children from the pressures of royal life, opting not to give Archie the title of prince at birth. While they claimed this decision was for his privacy, many saw it as a calculated move to distance their child from the institution they were criticizing. But behind closed doors, this choice caused tension. Senior royals questioned why Harry, a man who once fiercely defended his royal identity, would so willingly strip his son of the same honor. The weight of royal heritage is immense, and titles are more than mere labels. They carry with them centuries of legacy, responsibility, and public expectation. For the Windsors, denying Archie a title wasn't just a matter of privacy. It was seen as a rejection of the monarchy's very structure. Some advisors reportedly urged the couple to reconsider, warning them that their actions could lead to a permanent rift with the crown. But Harry and Meghan remained steadfast. They were forging a new path, and Archie, they insisted, would not be raised as a pawn in a centuries-old institution. This defiance, however, had unintended consequences. By stepping away from royal life, Harry and Meghan inadvertently made Archie the subject of even greater speculation. Every decision they made about him, from the choice of godparents to the limited public appearances, was scrutinized under a magnifying glass. When they announced their exit from royal duties in early 2020, the questions about Archie grew louder. Would he be raised in the United States? Would he ever meet his cousins again? Would he inherit anything from the royal family? And, more quietly, was he truly who they claimed he was? Inside the palace, the whispers became more pointed. There were murmurs among senior courtiers, subtle hints that certain documents related to Archie's birth were incomplete or missing. These were not just idle gossipers. These were individuals who had served the crown for decades and understood the meticulous record-keeping that accompanies a royal birth. Something was off, and those closest to King Charles began urging him to seek clarity. The challenge for Charles was not just about discovering the truth, but also about preserving the dignity of the monarchy. A scandal of this magnitude could shake public confidence in the institution, especially at a time when he was striving to modernize and stabilize it after years of turbulence. The monarchy had weathered storms before, divorces, affairs, and even abdications, but a question about the legitimacy of a royal child was something far more dangerous. It threatened to unravel the very concept of the bloodline, the foundation on which the crown rests. As the king reviewed reports from advisors, he began to notice inconsistencies himself. Dates didn't match. Certain medical protocols, standard for royal births, had been bypassed or obscured. While these irregularities could have been attributed to Harry and Meghan's desire for privacy, the sheer number of discrepancies raised red flags. Charles, who had once been reluctant to intervene in his son's personal life, now found himself with no choice. The future of the monarchy might depend on answers that only a direct investigation could provide. In the early days of his reign, Charles had made it clear that he would be a modern king, transparent, accountable, and willing to make tough decisions. But this was no ordinary challenge. This was his own family, his own blood. Could he truly question the paternity of his grandson without fracturing the relationship with his son beyond repair? Could he risk the public backlash that would surely follow if word got out? These were the questions that haunted him as he prepared to take a step that few monarchs have ever dared to take. The decision to quietly investigate Archie's lineage was not made lightly. It involved a small circle of trusted confidants and professionals who understood both the sensitivity and gravity of the situation. They began by collecting records, birth certificates, hospital reports, witness statements from staff who had been present during Meghan's pregnancy. The process was slow, deliberate, and shrouded in secrecy. Every move was calculated to avoid leaks, knowing that even a whisper of suspicion could set off a media firestorm. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan remained blissfully unaware of the inquiry brewing in London. They were busy building their brand in California, filming Netflix documentaries, and conducting interviews that portrayed their lives as a mix of struggle and triumph. To the public, they were the picture of a modern, liberated family, free from the constraints of tradition. But behind the scenes, the walls were closing in. The crown was watching, and soon, the truth would come knocking. The importance of this chapter in the royal story cannot be overstated. A legacy, centuries in the making, was now being questioned. The fate of a young boy, barely old enough to understand the world around him, was hanging in the balance. And the man at the center of it all, King Charles, was preparing to make a decision that would not only define his reign, but also determine the future of the monarchy itself. The question now was not just about who Archie was, but about what his existence meant for the crown. Could a child with disputed lineage hold a place in the line of succession? Could the monarchy afford to turn a blind eye to the growing evidence? Or was this the moment when Charles, once dismissed as indecisive, would show the world that he was willing to do what even his mother might not have done? Tear the veil from the truth, no matter the cost? The answers would come, but not without pain. For now, the story remained hidden behind palace walls, a secret whispered only among the few who dared to confront it. Yet the ripples of this secret were already beginning to spread, and soon, they would erupt into a storm that would shake the royal family to its core. In the carefully choreographed world of royalty, every gesture is deliberate, every choice scrutinized, and every deviation from protocol considered an act of rebellion or defiance. So when Meghan Markle entered the royal sphere, she brought with her not just a background foreign to British tradition, but a mindset rooted in personal agency, modern feminism, and Hollywood independence. To some, she was a breath of fresh air. To others, a disruptor. But as time would tell, her choices, particularly surrounding her pregnancy and the birth of Archie, were far from conventional, and they would become the foundation of one of the most explosive royal controversies in living memory. Even before Archie was conceived, Meghan had already started charting her own course through royal life. Unlike Kate Middleton, who gracefully adopted the customs and expectations of royal duty, Meghan appeared more selective, embracing the glamour while resisting the restrictions. Her attire often broke dress codes. Her interviews touched on topics the firm preferred to avoid. And when it came to her first pregnancy, it became immediately clear that Meghan would not follow the playbook handed down by royal matriarchs. The first signs of divergence appeared with the announcement itself. The news of Meghan's pregnancy came not via a royal press release, but during a tour of Australia. Rather than releasing the information through traditional palace channels or giving an exclusive to the British press, Harry and Meghan chose a soft, mid-tour reveal that caught even senior royals off guard. Some saw this as a spontaneous and sweet gesture. Others within the palace, however, saw it as yet another instance of Meghan bypassing protocol to control her own narrative. But it was what followed in the months ahead that truly raised alarm. Logo, love voice cloning, pricing, history, dashboard, someone like, See the most popular languages and voices. Learn more. Free text-to-speech over 200 voices and 70 languages. LaVoice is a free online text-to-speech (TTS) tool that turns your text into natural-sounding speech. We offer a wide range of AI voices. Simply input your text, choose a voice, and either download the resulting MP3 file or listen to it directly. Perfect for content creators, students, or anyone needing text read aloud. Try TTS. Learn more. Text-to-speech. File-to-speech. 19,522/20,000. Pauses. Clear text. Typically, royal pregnancies are surrounded by a moderate level of media access. Photographers capture the progression. Senior doctors are publicly associated with the birth. Arrangements for hospital admissions are discussed with palace advisors and published to the press. Meghan, on the other hand, shut those doors tight. From the beginning, she insisted on unprecedented levels of privacy. Few knew which doctors she was seeing. Even fewer knew where she planned to give birth. Senior courtiers were left in the dark, as were trusted family aides. It wasn't just a matter of keeping the media at bay. Meghan seemed to be actively removing the birth of her child from the institutional grip of the monarchy. While this may seem like a reasonable wish for any modern mother, to the royal establishment, it posed a dangerous precedent. Every royal birth is a matter of national interest, not just in terms of tradition, but in matters of lineage, succession, and public trust. As her pregnancy advanced, the rumors intensified. Some palace staffers, speaking only on condition of anonymity, whispered that Meghan had refused standard royal medical protocol, opting instead for a personal midwife and a private birthing plan. Others said she had chosen to keep hospital details secret until the very last moment. There were even whispers, although largely unconfirmed at the time, that Meghan had sought out alternative birthing options, such as hypnobirthing, which, although perfectly legitimate, diverged from the conventional procedures expected of royal births. The most controversial of all Meghan's decisions, however, came on the day of Archie's birth. In a move that stunned even seasoned royal watchers, the couple misled the public about the timing of the birth. On May 6, 2019, the palace announced that Meghan had gone into labor in the early hours of the morning. Just hours later, they declared that the baby had already been born. The timeline didn't add up. How could the palace have announced her labor and then, almost immediately after, announced the birth? This confusion sowed the seeds of doubt. People began to wonder, was Meghan ever at the hospital at all? Was the birth conducted under royal supervision? And most importantly, what exactly were they hiding? To add to the tension, there were no immediate public photographs, no press conference, no ceremonial appearance. Instead, a highly curated image was released 2 days later from St. George's Hall at Windsor Castle, where Meghan and Harry stood with Archie cradled in a white blanket. The photo, while sweet, felt staged, and for many viewers, it lacked the warmth and spontaneity that had marked other royal births. More conspicuous was the absence of any visible medical staff. There were no nurses or doctors in the frame, no mention of who had delivered the child or where exactly it had happened. The standard announcement on the easel at Buckingham Palace, which traditionally confirms a royal birth with medical signatures, was brief and vague. While the names of the doctors were eventually released, there was no media access, no formal interviews, and no insight into the birthing process. The entire affair seemed shrouded in fog. Then came the matter of the birth certificate. Released weeks later, the document listed Meghan's occupation as Princess of the United Kingdom, but left some observers with more questions than answers. The place of birth, Portland Hospital in London, was only confirmed retroactively. Critics noted that the certificate was submitted with unusual delay, and that the choice of hospital itself was curious. The Portland was known more for celebrity births than royal ones. Princess Diana had given birth at St. Mary's Hospital. So had Kate. Why not follow that tradition? Some palace insiders claimed that the Queen herself was displeased with the secrecy surrounding the birth, not because she wanted to interfere, but because it placed unnecessary strain on the royal household. Staff were overwhelmed with press inquiries they could not answer. Protocols for christening and succession documentation were thrown into disarray. What was normally a moment of national joy had turned into a bureaucratic headache and a reputational minefield. Then there was the christening. a private affair that only deepened the sense of division between Harry and Meghan and the rest of the royal family. While past royal christenings had involved public ceremonies, press access, and the naming of godparents, the Sussexes took a different route. Archie's christening was closed off to the public, photographs were tightly controlled, and the names of godparents were withheld entirely. This, again, was seen by many as a rebuke of tradition. In choosing secrecy over ceremony, Meghan had not only alienated members of the extended royal family, but also the public, who had long felt a personal connection to royal milestones. Royal sources later confirmed that senior officials were blindsided by the Sussexes' decision to exclude press and even some extended family from the event. To the monarchy, it was more than a breach of etiquette. It was a signal that Harry and Meghan were rejecting their royal obligations in favor of a curated, celebrity-like existence. But perhaps the most damning part of Meghan's choices was the effect they had on perception. While she and Harry insisted they were simply trying to protect their child, the constant evasion of royal procedures invited rumors. From surrogacy theories to speculations about Archie's true parentage, the couple's iron grip on information backfired. In attempting to control the narrative, they had instead lost it. And behind all of this was Meghan's insistence on doing things her way. Her American background, her experience in Hollywood, her mistrust of the press, all of it influenced how she navigated motherhood under a royal lens. But the monarchy isn't designed for that kind of autonomy. It operates on ceremony, not secrecy, on duty, not disruption. And in breaking the rules, Meghan had not only caused friction, she had awakened suspicion. The palace took note of every irregularity, every missing detail, every refusal to cooperate. At first, the focus was on public relations, how to calm the press, how to reassure the public. But slowly, those irregularities began to accumulate. And they didn't go unnoticed by the people who mattered most, those who protect the legacy of the crown. At the center of all this was a single, haunting question, one that no monarch ever wants to ask, one that no father should ever have to entertain. What if Archie wasn't Harry's son? That question, whispered only in the most secure corridors of the palace, would become the catalyst for a secret investigation that would shake the royal family to its foundations. Meghan's choices, so unconventional and fiercely defended, had inadvertently set the stage for suspicion. And once that suspicion took root, it grew with a force that could not be stopped. The coming chapters would reveal what happened when King Charles acted on that suspicion. When private doubts became royal inquiries. When DNA testing replaced blind trust. And when the truth, long buried under layers of protocol and press releases, finally emerged into the light. The legacy of a prince, the title of a child, the future of a family, all of it, now on the line. It should have been a celebration, a sacred tradition wrapped in joy and reverence. For centuries, royal christenings had been cherished moments, a blend of religion, ritual, and national pride. From Queen Elizabeth's baptism in the private chapel of Buckingham Palace to the public photographs of Prince George in his lace christening gown, these ceremonies served as milestones, not just for the family, but for the monarchy itself. But when it came time for Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor's christening, the event unfolded not as a national treasure, but as a locked-room mystery. And in that silence, suspicion took root. The world expected pomp and pageantry, cameras poised in anticipation. Journalists prepared special coverage. The people wanted to see the child, Archie, the bridge between tradition and change, the grandson of a future king. But that expectation was shattered the moment Harry and Meghan declared the ceremony would be private, not simply scaled down, not limited to press-approved access, completely, unequivocally private. No cameras, no public viewing, no ceremonial appearances by senior royals, no live feed from the chapel. It was as if the child's place in the royal timeline had been reduced to a ghost. The location, St. George's Chapel in Windsor, was familiar, hallowed ground where royal ceremonies had taken place for centuries. But while it looked the same on the outside, the mood was markedly different inside. Sources who later spoke on background revealed that even senior palace aides were uncertain who had been invited. The guest list had been curated tightly, with many traditional attendees reportedly excluded or notified at the last possible moment. More puzzling than the absence of fanfare was the secrecy surrounding the godparents. In nearly every royal christening prior, the names of godparents had been revealed to the public. This wasn't just about transparency. It was about lineage, social standing, and the preservation of royal heritage. Godparents are carefully chosen, often reflecting the family's alliances and internal power dynamics. By keeping the names hidden, Harry and Meghan sparked a fresh wave of theories. Was it a celebrity? A billionaire? Someone controversial? Or, more darkly, someone whose connection might shine unwanted light on Archie's origins? When questioned about the decision, the Sussexes insisted that they were simply protecting the privacy of close friends. But this explanation rang hollow for many within the palace. According to protocol, the names would normally be recorded in official court circulars, even if not publicly celebrated. Yet in Archie's case, there was no such entry for weeks. And when details finally emerged, they were sparse, almost reluctant, as if the palace was itself unsure what to say or how to frame a christening that broke so completely with custom. Even the baptismal gown sparked confusion. Archie, like many royal babies before him, was said to have worn the replica Huntington lace gown, an exact reproduction of the one commissioned by Queen Victoria in 1841. But no photo ever confirmed this. The only image released to the public, a single, dimly lit portrait, showed Harry, Meghan, Archie, and several royal figures in a room at Windsor Castle. Yet even this photograph was odd. It appeared overly formal, lacking warmth. Meghan's expression seemed tense. Harry, often animated in public, looked stiff and wary. And Archie's face, the centerpiece of the image, was barely visible. A blur of cloth, a turned cheek, a barely there outline of a child the world had waited to see. Critics pounced. Where was the proud royal family smiling for the cameras? Why wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury shown performing the ceremony? Why did the palace release so little information? Was it just a clash of values, privacy versus protocol? Or was there something deeper being concealed? Within royal circles, those questions weren't rhetorical. Some insiders began to connect dots. If the couple had taken such great pains to limit visibility around the birth, and now the christening, could it be that they were hiding something they couldn't explain? Whispers grew louder. Staff began to trade theories, especially among those who had worked in both Kensington and Windsor households. One former aide reportedly remarked, "It was as if they didn't want anyone to really see him, not truly." For the Queen, this departure from tradition was more than just an inconvenience. It was, in some ways, an erosion of the very institution she had spent her life preserving. To her, these ceremonies weren't just about family, they were about continuity, public trust, royal identity. She had personally presided over the christenings of her own children and grandchildren. Now, with Archie, she was sidelined, her presence reduced to a photograph in which she appeared visibly reserved. And yet, no one could publicly challenge the Sussexes without igniting a full-blown constitutional crisis. The Queen, as always, chose restraint. But behind palace walls, conversations turned from exasperation to concern. Meghan and Harry had not merely ignored royal traditions, they had upended them. And in doing so, they had placed themselves, and their child, on a path of increasing isolation. One detail that further unsettled royal advisors was the absence of certain expected paperwork. Typically, a baptism in the Church of England requires a clear public record. But in Archie's case, the official registry was not released for weeks. When it finally surfaced, it listed the date, the names of Harry and Meghan, and the officiant, but little else. No mention of additional witnesses. No statements from clergy. No confirmatory quotes from the palace. The secrecy fed the fire of speculation. Was Archie really baptized at all? And if so, why go to such great lengths to hide it? The implications of an improperly conducted royal christening are not just symbolic. They can be legal. Baptism in the Church of England is a requirement for full integration into the royal succession. Without it, certain titles, responsibilities, and privileges cannot be conferred. While many assumed the ceremony had indeed occurred, the lack of transparency made others wonder, had the couple knowingly undermined the process? Inside Clarence House, where King Charles now held regular briefings with senior advisors, murmurs turned into strategy sessions. A line had been crossed. One advisor, speaking under condition of anonymity, described a growing unease. It wasn't just that they did things differently. It's that they refused to acknowledge how their actions affected the institution. That's when we began to worry there might be more going on than anyone had realized. The photographs of the event, when finally released, were scrutinized for every detail. Who stood where? Who smiled? And who didn't? Body language analysts were invited to dissect the postures. Meghan's hand, protective on Archie's chest. Harry, angled slightly away from the group. The Queen, composed but distant. And Prince William and Catherine, absent entirely. No official reason was given. But palace watchers suspected a silent protest, a quiet rebuke of a ceremony that seemed more Hollywood than holy. To the public, the christening was a mystery. To the palace, it became a clue that added to a growing list of irregularities. The secrecy of the birth, the inconsistencies on the certificate, the quiet maneuvering around royal documentation. And now, a christening shrouded in such privacy that even the most seasoned royal correspondents were left bewildered. Each of these moments might have been forgivable in isolation, but together, they formed a pattern that pointed not just to Meghan and Harry's desire for control, but to the possibility that they were hiding something more profound, something that went beyond privacy and preference. The christening should have been a turning point, a moment to bring the family together. Instead, it deepened the divide. And when questions emerged about Archie's lineage, the memories of that day, the half-seen photographs, the missing names, the invisible ceremony, took on a darker hue. Could it be, some dared to ask, that the secrecy wasn't about privacy at all? Could it be that the ceremony had been designed to obscure, not to celebrate? And if so, what was the truth they were so desperate to bury? King Charles, a man long trained to suppress emotion in favor of duty, now had little choice but to confront that possibility. Because the moment the godparents remained unnamed, the moment the baptism was hidden from record, was the moment he began to fear that the boy presented to the world as his grandson might not be his grandson at all. And so, quietly, methodically, the wheels of inquiry began to turn. What started as a ceremony became a cipher, and the answers it concealed would soon come bursting to light. For most of his life, Prince Harry lived under the scorching glare of flashbulbs. From his earliest days as a ginger-haired toddler shadowing his mother to his rebellious adolescence as a young man grappling with loss, scrutiny was never a stranger. But while Prince William grew into the role of dutiful heir with practiced poise, Harry's relationship with the public and with the press was always charged, always personal, and at times, dangerously adversarial. It was perhaps understandable, then, that when he became a father, his instinct would be to shield his child from the relentless exposure that had, by his account, haunted his own life. But as with everything surrounding Archie Harrison, Harry's pursuit of privacy seemed to move beyond protection and veer into calculated concealment. Privacy was never a novel concept in the royal family. Queen Elizabeth II, despite being one of the most recognized figures on earth, managed to preserve an astonishing amount of personal space. Even Diana, the media's most favored royal magnate, balanced her public obligations with moments of intimate solitude for her sons. But Harry's stance on privacy, particularly after marrying Meghan, became less about balance and more about barricade. Shortly after Archie's birth, Harry began making swift, firm decisions that directly countered palace protocol. First came the refusal to release detailed birth information. Then, his insistence that no press be allowed near the hospital. There were no hospital steps, no waving from behind the glass, no short interviews for the world. All the typical, expected gestures of transparency vanished. The message was loud and clear. Archie would not be a public figure. At least, not under Harry's terms. While the media roared in protest, Harry's inner circle defended his choices. Friends close to the prince described him as traumatized by the press and haunted by what he believed had been the media's role in his mother's death. To them, Archie was sacred territory, a line not to be crossed. But the palace found itself in a bind. Royal protocol and public expectation demand a degree of visibility. After all, the monarchy is funded, supported, and sustained by the people. With that comes a certain level of access. Harry didn't see it that way. In interviews, including the couple's explosive sit-down with Oprah Winfrey, Harry referenced generational pain, systemic racism, and the corrosive effects of tabloid culture. He believed he had a moral duty to protect his family, and many sympathized. But others, particularly within royal ranks, began to wonder if Harry's efforts were less about protection and more about avoidance. Even the few glimpses offered to the public were tightly curated. Occasional images released on social media, often featuring Archie turned away from the camera. Snippets of videos with his voice carefully muted, his location obscured. The choices seemed deliberate, almost aggressively so. And yet, amid this wall of privacy, Meghan and Harry themselves remained extraordinarily visible. Interviews, podcasts, Netflix specials, they poured their truth into every possible channel. Except, it seemed, when it came to their son. This contradiction drew criticism. If privacy was so essential, why monetize their experiences? Why sell their stories, write memoirs, shoot documentaries, while guarding Archie as if he were part of a state secret? To many, this inconsistency revealed more than just a desire to shield a child. It suggested a larger strategy, that Archie's visibility, or lack thereof, was part of a broader narrative, one carefully managed by his parents for reasons known only to them. And within the walls of the palace, concern deepened. Royal advisors began to ask uncomfortable questions, not out of malice, but out of duty. Why was so much documentation missing? Why was Archie rarely seen at family events? Why were even internal staffers denied access to the child's schedule, photographs, or health updates? In one particular instance, a royal source revealed that a planned family photo session during Christmas had to be abruptly canceled because Harry and Meghan declined to bring Archie. Senior aides grew frustrated. From a procedural standpoint, a royal child's records are not just personal, they are institutional. Birth certificates, baptismal entries, proof of residency. All of these form a trail essential for both history and succession. But in Archie's case, the trail was unusually faint. And when challenged, Harry's response remained the same: privacy. Palace whispers turned into briefings. Lawyers were discreetly consulted. What rights did the crown have, if any, to investigate matters that Harry and Meghan insisted were private? What were the legal thresholds for ensuring lineage? And at what point did a royal's claim to privacy infringe upon the crown's obligation to the people? The line was blurry. But as the months rolled on, it became harder to ignore what many feared: that Harry's obsession with shielding Archie was not simply about keeping him out of the limelight, but about concealing truths too damaging to reveal. Then came the move to North America. When the Sussexes left the UK and relocated first to Canada, then to California, the distance amplified the mystery. Archie disappeared almost entirely from public view. No school photos, no playdate outings, no royal events, not even a candid paparazzi shot. For a child born into one of the most photographed families in the world, this level of invisibility was unprecedented. Meanwhile, Harry's war with the British press intensified. He filed lawsuits. He penned op-eds. He called out journalists by name. In one statement, he likened media intrusion to a slow-motion car crash. In another, he claimed that history was repeating itself, with Meghan cast as Diana and Archie at risk of becoming another casualty. The language was emotional, even visceral. But within royal circles, it also raised a critical question. Was Harry so blinded by his trauma that he could no longer distinguish between legitimate public interest and genuine intrusion? And if so, was this blindness now affecting the crown's ability to preserve its own integrity? Behind closed doors, King Charles grew increasingly disturbed by the pattern. For a man long criticized for being aloof, Charles had matured into a monarch who valued transparency. His vision for a streamlined monarchy, one that was accountable, modern, and reflective of public sentiment, was being undermined by his own son's choices. And while he had long avoided confrontation for the sake of family unity, the issue of Archie's status had become impossible to ignore. One particular moment reportedly shifted Charles's stance. During a formal briefing on royal succession and estate planning, a senior advisor requested updated documents on Archie's lineage. The request came as part of routine paperwork, but the response, complete silence from the Sussex camp, set off alarm bells. For an institution built on records, confirmation, and precision, this kind of omission was a red flag. Charles was no longer willing to ignore it. Whether driven by doubt or duty, he began pressing for answers. Quiet inquiries were made. Questions were posed to former staff. One aide was dispatched to review private hospital logs. Another was asked to verify family photos and timestamps. Each breadcrumb led to the same uneasy conclusion. There was no clear chain of verification. And so, the idea that had once lived in the shadows, whispered between aides, feared by officials, now stood squarely in the light. What if Harry's obsession with privacy was not about protecting Archie, but protecting a secret? What if the boy who bore the Windsor name was not, in fact, a Windsor at all? The palace could no longer rely on trust. Not when trust had been tested and stretched beyond recognition. The crown needed clarity. And for King Charles, a man raised in the echoing halls of duty, clarity meant investigation. What followed was a decision that would change everything, a discreet but formal effort to uncover the truth. No announcements, no leaks, just silence and a growing storm behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace has always been a place of grandeur and silence, where gilded halls echo not with voices but with tradition, and where the true business of the monarchy is done not in the press, but in whispers. Yet in recent years, those whispers had grown louder, sharper, and more persistent. Especially when it came to Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the little boy named Archie who seemed to drift in and out of royal life like a rumor, rather than a flesh-and-blood heir. And as those whispers passed from footmen to aides, from lords to chamberlains, a quiet fear began to crystallize. It was no longer just idle gossip. It was a suspicion no one dared to voice aloud, but many feared to be true. Inside the palace, discretion is sacred. Staff who serve the royal family do so for decades, often entire lifetimes, governed by codes of silence and loyalty that rival those of the intelligence services. But even in such a sealed environment, rumors have a way of seeping through marble floors and into mahogany-paneled drawing rooms. And these were not ordinary rumors. They touched the heart of the monarchy's foundation, lineage, inheritance, legitimacy. It started subtly. A conversation overheard in the corridor between two senior aides about discrepancies in Archie's birth record. A note passed during a late-night strategy meeting questioning the lack of medical documentation. A glance exchanged between royal advisors as another public appearance passed without Archie in sight. These moments added up. They became a pattern. And within that pattern, a possibility began to grow that no one wanted to consider. What if something had gone terribly wrong? Or worse, what if something had been carefully orchestrated? Within months of Harry and Meghan's departure to North America, the royal household found itself in an administrative maze. Questions about Archie's title, inheritance rights, and future obligations remained unanswered. Legal departments requested clarification on security provisions, family estate clauses, and succession technicalities. Each request was met with stonewalling, delays, or vague statements from the Sussex team in California. But it wasn't just the paperwork that raised concern, it was the staff. Palace employees who had once served the couple began to speak in quiet tones, behind locked doors. Former nannies, protection officers, and aides who had been reassigned or quietly let go. Some of them expressed unease about how little time they had actually spent with the child. Others mentioned being excluded from rooms where they were normally present. One senior household member confided to a trusted colleague that there were moments when it felt as though Archie was being kept hidden, not just from the public, but from the palace itself. That's when the whispers began to harden into questions. Why were routine procedures skipped during Meghan's pregnancy? Why was the royal medical team not more involved? Why was the birth timeline so inconsistent? Why had certain members of staff been abruptly dismissed or transferred after asking too many questions? And most disturbingly, why did so many key events involving Archie happen behind closed doors, without witnesses, without documentation, and without the traditional vetting that the institution relies on? King Charles, though naturally inclined to caution and reconciliation, was not blind. He had spent his life watching how personal choices could affect public legacy. He had seen his own reputation savaged during his divorce from Diana. He had weathered public scorn, family implosions, and relentless scrutiny. And he knew that when whispers began to mount within the palace, they could not be ignored. So he began listening. Carefully, selectively. One of the first people he spoke to was a senior member of the royal household who had been present during the early days of Archie's life. The advisor, deeply loyal to the crown, shared an unsettling pattern. An increasing number of staff had raised concerns, not about abuse or neglect, but about absence. Absence of presence. Absence of documentation. Absence of basic accountability. Others followed. A nurse who had once been scheduled to assist during the postnatal period claimed she had been told her services were no longer required, even before meeting the baby. A palace photographer admitted privately that he had been prohibited from entering certain rooms during Archie's first official photo session, an unprecedented limitation in royal documentation. A trusted butler remarked that during a 2-week stretch, the royal nursery remained empty and untouched, with no sign of a baby residing in it. At first glance, these stories sounded inconclusive. But in the palace, where consistency and routine are paramount, any deviation is suspect. And when deviations begin to stack up, they signal something more serious, something institutional. In response, Charles directed his private secretary to discreetly review internal communications from that time. Emails, memos, schedules. He didn't issue an order. He issued a request. A distinction that allowed plausible deniability, but still opened doors. What the private secretary uncovered didn't offer definitive proof, but it did deepen the unease. Gaps in scheduling. Unexplained cancellations. Sudden reassignment of personnel. It was a spiderweb of small contradictions that, when woven together, revealed a concerning picture. The most alarming discovery came from the royal archives, where a historian tasked with maintaining the continuity of royal records quietly flagged an anomaly. A series of documents tied to Archie's early months, hospital admissions, security clearances, travel logs, were either missing, incomplete, or heavily redacted. None of this should have been possible. Royal archives are meticulously maintained, often with multiple layers of redundancy. For entire documents to disappear or be altered suggested either gross negligence or a deliberate effort to obscure. That was when the conversation changed. From suspicion to action. From whispers to inquiry. Charles convened a small, confidential group comprised of his most trusted aides. The goal was not to initiate a witch hunt. It was to determine whether the integrity of the monarchy had been compromised. They knew that any misstep could implode in their faces. Accusing a royal of deception, even silently, risked catastrophe. But the stakes were too high. If Archie was not Harry's biological son, if he was not, in fact, born of royal blood, then the line of succession, already fragile, was potentially tainted. The ripple effects could stretch across generations. Among the group was a retired intelligence advisor, brought in not for espionage expertise, but for his discretion and skill in pattern recognition. He reviewed the palace's findings, spoke with staff, and analyzed inconsistencies in the timeline. His assessment was measured, but firm. While not conclusive, he believed there was enough cause to pursue further verification. In his words, the burden of transparency lies with those who broke tradition, not those upholding it. Still, Charles hesitated. To order a formal DNA test of his own grandson felt like a betrayal so deep it bordered on treason. But the evidence was becoming overwhelming. Not a smoking gun, but a field of glowing embers that threatened to ignite with the slightest gust of wind. And gust it did. Just days after one of these internal meetings, a former palace staffer granted an anonymous interview to a foreign journalist. While the story was buried in international outlets and framed as speculative, it contained details so specific, so intimate, that they could only have come from someone inside. The article raised questions about Archie's birth, suggested alternative timelines, and quoted an unnamed source who claimed, "Even the king has his doubts." That sentence sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. What had been private inquiry now risked becoming public scandal. The time for whispers had passed. The palace needed certainty, and the only way to get it was through biological proof. The moment the foreign press hinted that even the monarch harbored doubts about Archie Harrison's parentage, the quiet storm brewing inside Buckingham Palace transformed into a full-blown crisis. King Charles III, a man who had long championed reform within the monarchy but always sought to avoid family implosion, now faced a decision that tested not only his leadership but his very identity as a father and grandfather. Was it possible that the son of his beloved second-born child was not truly a Windsor? And more importantly, what was he prepared to do about it? The decision to open a discreet probe was not made overnight. It came after weeks, months even, of accumulating inconsistencies, private testimonies, unexplained absences, and administrative confusion. And now, it came in the face of a rapidly disintegrating wall of secrecy. Charles had weathered his share of royal scandals before, but this was different. This was personal. The integrity of the crown, the public's trust, and the future of the monarchy itself hung in the balance. He didn't want spectacle. He didn't want scandal. What he needed was clarity. Charles summoned his most trusted senior advisor, Lord Harold Whitcomb, a man known for his discretion and steel-trap memory, and someone who had served under both Queen Elizabeth II and himself. Their conversation was held in the private study at Clarence House, far from the listening ears of palace staff and security. There, the king laid out his concerns not as sovereign, but as a man torn between loyalty to family and duty to his nation. They reviewed what was known. The inconsistencies in Archie's medical records, the missing names on birth and baptismal documentation, the eyewitness accounts from palace staff who reported being shut out of standard protocol, and the worrying irregularities in travel and security logs. Whitcomb, usually a man of measured tone, grew visibly unsettled. He understood the weight of what they were stepping into. If the child in question were anyone but a royal, the matter could be brushed aside. But Archie wasn't just any child. He was, at least by public understanding, seventh in line to the throne. The question was no longer whether a probe should be launched, it was how. Charles insisted that the investigation remain completely confidential. No outside contractors. No hired firms. He would not tolerate the media getting even the faintest whiff of what was happening behind closed doors. That meant relying entirely on internal palace intelligence, leveraging the expertise of trusted insiders, and, where necessary, reaching out to the government's discreet arms of service. Not a MI5, not a MI6, something quieter, older. The royal household's private intelligence desk, an often overlooked unit whose job was to manage royal security and background checks without drawing attention. The man chosen to oversee the probe was Sir Alastair Trenwith, a veteran security advisor who had served the monarchy for decades in silent shadows. He had never appeared in tabloids, had no official online presence, and answered only to the monarch and the Lord Chamberlain. Trenwith's job was not to speculate or judge. His job was to verify. The first order of business was to obtain a DNA sample. This, more than anything, posed the greatest challenge. Archie was now living full-time in Montecito, California, well beyond the legal reach of the British monarchy. With no warrant, no authority, and no cooperation from Harry and Meghan, obtaining a legitimate and lawful sample would be nearly impossible. Trenwith proposed three paths. First, attempt voluntary cooperation from the Sussexes, which he privately believed was doomed to fail. Second, identify whether any past legitimate samples, such as infant medical records or archived hair from royal haircuts, still existed within royal medical files. And third, if neither yielded results, then the last resort would be tracking down third-party test results, such as any taken during hospital visits or checkups while the Sussexes still resided in the UK. The king opted for a dual path. Approach Harry under the guise of reconnection, and simultaneously begin archival retrieval of any materials that might already exist. Charles made the call to Harry himself. What began as a seemingly warm outreach quickly turned cold. Harry, initially surprised by his father's rare direct contact, grew defensive the moment the topic of updating official documents came up. According to a palace source with knowledge of the conversation, Harry questioned why the palace suddenly cared about paperwork now, after having dismissed so many of his concerns in the past. The call ended politely, but tensely, with Harry promising to talk to Meghan and get back to him. He never did. That conversation confirmed what Charles already feared. Cooperation would not be coming from Montecito. The Sussexes had closed ranks. So the archival route was activated. Royal archivists and medical officers were granted temporary clearance to review restricted files from the months surrounding Archie's birth. Much of the documentation had been locked down under a privacy classification installed by Meghan and Harry shortly before their exit from royal duties. But with the king's authorization, Trenwith and Whitcomb gained access to a collection of medical logs, household schedules, and even CCTV records from Windsor properties. There was no eureka moment. No single piece of evidence that blew the case open. What they found, instead, was a pattern of absence. Hospital logs that were normally detailed and cross-checked with security clearances were unusually thin. Internal security reports showed inconsistencies in who entered and exited the maternity ward at Portland Hospital. Meghan's prenatal visit records were unusually redacted, more than any other royal on file. Even the list of assigned pediatricians appeared vague, with substitute names listed and no continuity of care. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate obfuscation. But then came a small breakthrough. In one of the logs from early June 2019, a note from a royal security officer mentioned an incident involving DNA swabs. The note was brief, lacking detail, but it indicated that during a postnatal health screening, a sample had been taken as part of routine infant testing. While not specific to paternity, it was a starting point. The security officer, now retired, was located in Dorset and contacted under the pretense of a personnel review. When asked about the note, he recalled that during a wellness appointment, conducted discreetly at Frogmore Cottage, medical staff had been asked to submit samples for both mother and child as part of immigration and travel documentation protocols for future overseas travel. And that meant the palace had a potential lead. A request was sent, discreetly and without identifying information, to the archived private medical wing that had handled the test. Under royal classification, certain medical specimens are stored for years before being destroyed. After several tense days, a reply came confirming that the specimen had not yet been disposed of. A chain of custody was established. The sample was retrieved, authenticated, and passed to the Royal Medical Examiner, accompanied by a matching Y chromosome test from Prince Harry's own records already filed and routinely used for previous health screenings. The results came back within days. The initial test was labeled as inconclusive, a term that, medically speaking, indicated either contamination or sample degradation. But the examiner, aware of the importance of clarity, recommended a second, more advanced analysis. This time, the sample was sent to a specialist lab in Switzerland that had worked with royal health data before. There, under the most stringent testing protocols available, the truth finally surfaced. The Y chromosome markers did not match. The boy tested, whoever he was not the biological son of Prince Harry. The report was delivered to King Charles in a locked leather dossier, hand-carried by Lord Whitcomb himself. When Charles read the conclusion, he reportedly said nothing for several minutes. Then, with shaking hands, he folded the report closed and whispered, "God help us all." The discreet probe had done its job. The veil of secrecy was now torn. What remained was the impossible task of deciding what to do with the truth. There are moments in the history of a monarchy when the ground beneath its centuries-old foundations trembles, not from war or political rebellion, but from something infinitely more intimate, truth. It came quietly, wrapped in scientific certainty, divorced from emotion, yet destined to destroy hearts and shake allegiances. A series of test results, discreetly conducted and meticulously verified, had now delivered a revelation that few inside the monarchy could comprehend, let alone prepare for. The boy known as Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor, celebrated as a royal heir, globally recognized and sworn into history with titles and privileges, did not share a biological link with Prince Harry. The report from the Swiss lab was direct, clinical, and irreversible in its implications. It read like any standard genetic analysis: numbers, charts, probabilities. But nestled within those cool columns of data was a message more explosive than any tabloid headline could ever script. The Y chromosome match, the one genetic marker passed from father to son for generations, was absent. Prince Harry was not Archie's biological father. The confirmation stunned the core of the monarchy. King Charles, who had authorized the quiet inquiry with the gravest of concerns, now sat in his private chamber with the final page of the report still trembling between his fingers. Around him, silence settled like dust. Lord Whitcomb, the ever-loyal advisor, said nothing. There were no prepared statements, no suggested responses. No one had expected this outcome to be confirmed, not really. Suspicions were one thing. Proof was another. This was real, and real was terrifying. The immediate reaction was deeply human. Charles, for all his formality, was a father before he was a king. And to him, the idea that Harry, his son, his troubled, beloved second-born, had been unknowingly raising a child who was not his own was an agony no parent should ever bear witness to. Reports from insiders suggest that Charles didn't rage. He didn't shout or throw the report across the room. He simply lowered his head, closed his eyes, and whispered a single line. What have they done to him? For decades, the British royal family had operated under the burden of legacy, of perfection, of cold tradition. But in this moment, everything about those traditions, duty, bloodline, title, had been flipped on its head. If Archie was not Harry's son, then the legitimacy of his presence in the royal succession was void. But worse than that, it opened a floodgate of even darker questions. Who knew? How long had this truth been hidden? And most importantly, who was the real father? The palace's internal team of advisors immediately swung into action, not with press releases or spin, but with damage control of a different kind, containment. Only 5 people were aware of the DNA findings. Charles, Lord Whitcomb, Sir Alastair Trenwith, the royal medical examiner, and the Swiss lab liaison. All were sworn to silence, bound by written non-disclosure directives and decades of loyalty to the crown. They knew the clock had started. If this truth leaked, the monarchy could face its most devastating public reckoning since the abdication crisis of 1936. And yet, silence would not be sustainable forever. There was the matter of Archie's legal documents, his place in the royal family registry, the titles associated with him, the financial trusts prepared in his name. Each of these threads now had to be examined, questioned, potentially revised. More importantly, there was the constitutional issue. If Archie was not Harry's biological child, he had no legal right to his position in the line of succession. This wasn't a small matter. This was about the core definition of what it meant to be royal. It became clear to Charles that a confrontation with Harry was no longer avoidable. For years, their relationship had been strained by distance, by differing values, by scandal and betrayal. But now, Charles was preparing to sit his son down and present him with evidence that would break his heart. There was no precedent for this. No handbook for telling your child that the boy he believes to be his son might never have been. But before such a conversation could happen, more had to be understood. The palace team needed to answer 2 questions. First, whether Meghan had knowingly misled Prince Harry about Archie's parentage, and second, who the biological father might be. If the situation was a tragic mistake, a mix-up, or a previously undisclosed IVF procedure gone awry, then perhaps it could be addressed privately. But if this was intentional, if Meghan had deceived the royal family knowingly, then it would be regarded as one of the most explosive betrayals in modern royal history. Investigators turned to the narrow window of time in 2018 and 2019 when Meghan's pregnancy was first announced and later carried to term. Security logs, travel manifests, and internal correspondence were re-examined. Attention was focused on her private appointments in the months before the birth, including unrecorded trips to private clinics and non-royal consultants. What emerged was a chaotic pattern of untracked movements and unexplained medical consultations, more signs that something had been deliberately concealed. Even more troubling were internal memos from the Duchess's staff at Frogmore Cottage. Several aides had resigned during that period, citing a toxic work environment. At the time, their departures were attributed to personality clashes and the pressures of royal life. But one private memo, drafted by a now-silenced aide, referenced unusual instructions surrounding maternal care and visitor access, implying that Meghan had gone to great lengths to isolate herself during key parts of the pregnancy. Did Harry know? Sources within the palace remain divided. Some believe Harry was genuinely unaware, that he was caught in the whirlwind of love, rebellion, and the desire to protect his wife from media intrusion. Others are less sure. There are those who think Harry may have suspected something was off, but chose willful ignorance rather than face a truth too painful to confront. After all, he had lost a mother. Could he bear to lose a son? The report's arrival created ripple effects far beyond the palace gates. Though the public had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes, subtle changes began taking place. Mentions of Archie on official websites were carefully edited. Photos once used for press materials were quietly removed. The line of succession page, while still intact, had an unspoken air of uncertainty hanging over it. Public engagements involving Archie, once discussed as possibilities, were now absent from planning meetings. Inside Clarence's house, Charles ordered the family legal team to begin preparing two separate paths. One for public disclosure, if it ever became necessary, and one for private settlement, should the matter be kept within the firm. Each path required careful management of titles, inheritances, and family reputation. Either path meant pain. Either path meant fallout. But Charles, for all his heartbreak, had made one decision already. Archie's title would not be made permanent. Until the matter was resolved, no further privileges would be extended, no documents would be finalized. As far as the crown was concerned, the child known as Archie Harrison was in limbo. And yet, the boy himself remained untouched by the drama. Innocent, unaware, likely playing in a sunlit garden half a world away while the world's oldest monarchy prepared for what might be its most personal reckoning. Because truth, once unearthed, cannot be reburied. And a crown, once cracked by betrayal, can never shine quite the same again.